Well, very okay. Good afternoon to all of you. It's really a proud privilege for all of us at both Jindal School of Government and Public Policy as well as OP Jindal Global University to host Dr. Naresh Singh and this distinguished lecture. As many of you know, Dr. Naresh Singh has been working in the field of development for many decades. His vast experience of working in government and intergovernmental organizations, think tanks and research institutions, and now in the university is our students could not have had a better person in him to be able to reflect on some of the big challenges. As many of you know, the International Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor was one of the very important institutional mechanisms. Particularly, it had huge relevance after the post-tsunami recovery, in which issues relating to entitlement as well as property rights were carefully re-examined. One of our good friends of the university, who is no longer Professor Arjun Sengupta, was also a distinguished member of the International Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor, and I know that Professor Sengupta would have been very delighted to have Dr. Naresh Singh visit us and be part of what Dr. Singh and what we are doing. I'm also particularly grateful to Dr. Naresh Singh because it is rarely you find people who are ready to spend their time, their energy, their own resources, and be part of such an initiative with little or no expectations. For a variety of reasons, the kind of arrangement that we have had for Dr. Naresh Singh is honorary in nature, and that essentially means more than anything, he doesn't get paid for what he's doing. And that's something quite extraordinary, because for anybody to do something like that, it shows his own personal commitment and dedication to the cause that he is promoting. And I am particularly thankful to Dr. Singh for his time, for his leadership, and indeed for all the inspiration that he's giving to the faculty and the students. So without further ado, I would like to also briefly apologize for my delay. But today has been a particularly hectic day, but I'm here, and let's have Dr. Naresh Singh give his lecture. Yeah, sure.
Vice Chancellor, thank you very much. It's my turn to say thanks. I think I owe a great debt of gratitude to yourself and to Dean Sudarshan, and to Professor Murthy as registrar. And especially in terms of Dr. Mamta, the Deputy Registrar, they have together helped to make my life very comfortable. So I thank you for the hospitality you have shown, and my wife Sherry has joined us as well, who you will meet afterwards. And we are therefore thankful to the university community for hosting us. It was, when I took the decision to come here, it was because, as you said, I do think that, and this talk will essentially be arguing that most of the big changes will have to come from individuals who take the leadership to promote that change, whether it's in institutions or whether it's a social change. You know, we could speak forever about all kinds of technical and intellectual shifts, which I will talk about, but unless we are individually committed, we won't get the kinds of changes that will be required in the post-2015 era. So with that, let me get underway, because I would like to leave some time for interaction, which is always the nicer part of these conversations. Otherwise, we would have had a dry and perhaps meaningless monologue, which we would try to avoid. So what I want to do, before we talk about 2015, why don't we reflect quickly on what we have done already? So I'm going to start with the Second World War, and don't panic, we will get it done in time. I'm going to start from the time we started international development issues, and the first thing we tried to promote development was something called economic growth, which we all know. And when economic growth failed to deliver the goods, we tried something else called social development. And when social development was not delivering, we say, we got it right now. So what we got to do is combine these two. Easy. In the UN, we have this great ability to synthesize, to combine things. So we got socioeconomic development introduced in the literature in the mid-60s. And when that wasn't doing the job, we then tried something else. We said, you know what? We are trying to develop things So maybe we should focus on developing people. So we got this brilliant idea that we'll do human development. But it was more than that. It's a bit cynical to say that alone, because human development was a fundamental shift from the way we did development, although it was not clearly articulated when it was first introduced in the 70s. It was much better articulated later on with the Human Development Report and the work of Mahbubul Haq and Amartya Sen, which we'll talk about later on. So when we tried the human development thing, even then we were not getting it right. And then we figured maybe human development, yes, is important, but we're trying to do too much. So instead of all of human development, why don't we just focus on basic needs? Just one part of human development. And that's what we tried for a while. And when we still were not seeming to get it right, we then said, maybe it's not the what, maybe it's the how. So let's try participatory development, endogenous development, working at local levels, engaging people. And that's not new, although whenever anybody comes to one of these things, they figure it's new. But that was with us since I would say the early 80s. While we were busy with the development work, we started to have another problem catching up with us because we were not getting things right. And that started to be recognized at the international stage in 1972 when Sweden, the forests of Sweden were being burnt down by acid rain coming from neighboring countries. And they couldn't solve the problem on their own. So they asked the United Nations to hold a conference. You know, the UN is good at that. And there are many things which the UN does really good, including world conferences. And so the UN held a conference in Stockholm on the human environment in 1972. So when they did the Human Environment Conference in 72, they set up UNEP and they did a bunch of other related issues. But then we take stock, you know, after we have a big conference, we do the conference plus 5, meaning 5 years later, and we do the conference plus 10, meaning 10 years later, and so on. So after 1972, they took stock in 1982, and what they found was something dramatic. The rich world was beginning to talk about the environment, but the poor world was preoccupied with poverty. And so in the UN, we found we had a big division between the rich and the poor. The famous North-South divide was alive and well. And so they set up a commission headed by a lady from Norway, the Prime Minister of Norway, Mrs. Brundtland. It was called the Brundtland Commission. And they did a brilliant thing. For me, one of the most brilliant breakthroughs in the diplomatic world was the coinage of the word sustainable development. That phrase, powerful phrase. So what they did was, in order to get the North and the South to sit at the same table, they did not talk about the environment or development separately, but we talked about sustainable development, in which we were all interested. That was a big issue then. The problem is that, like I will share with you later on, the problem with sustainable development, like the ambassador of Malaysia was chairing the Commission on Sustainable Development, which they have now thrown out, not because of this incident I'm going to tell you about, but because it's lived its life. And I was in this meeting. The problem with sustainable development is well summed up by what he said. So they were busy debating a piece of language, and the chair of the European Union, which was Portugal at that time, he said, on behalf of my own delegation and the delegation of the European Union, the language proposed before us is not acceptable. We really do not understand what you're trying to say. And the Indian delegate, the ambassador of India to the United Nations, stood up and said, Mr. Chairman, we have consulted widely. This language is widely accepted. I suggest that we proceed. The chairman then summed up the debate, and he said, brilliantly I thought, the United Nations is not about clarity, it is about consensus. The language is accepted. And he banged his hammer in the usual way, and we proceeded. Problem then with sustainable development is really well summarized there, because everybody sees what they want to see in that word. That's how you get consensus. But then nobody can implement it. Right? The UN is not so much about implementation like it is about consensus. So when it comes up with something, no, you will have huge challenges getting it done. So I think that was important. It sets the stage for what I'm going to tell you next. And then another brilliant thing happened. UNDP had adopted human development as what it will be its mission. But now the 1992 conference had happened, and sustainable development was the big thing. So UNDP brilliantly brought the two together. And they said, our role will be sustainable human development. Now they just said so. I mean, I'm talking to a very erstwhile colleague here who spent and still spends time with the UNDP. But the problem with sustainable human development, it has a lot of great things which I have put there. It has a lot of great things in it, including sustainable livelihoods, which you might know is what I've spent my life doing. And that is an operational way of dealing with sustainable human development. But the problem in sustainable human development, simply put, is human development is what we are all excited about. But we don't ask the policy question, at what cost to the natural ecosystems? So every time a country does better on the HDI, the Human Development Index, we don't ask the question, how did it do it? Did it do it by destroying the natural ecosystems or not? If it did, then we will not have the HDI. We will then have an index called the SHDI, which would ask the question, improvements in HDI at what cost? Well, I raised that question with Sudhir Anand decades ago. Sudhir and I were discussing this issue. And he is one of the guys who helped to devise this index called the HDI. He and Amartya Sen and Mahbub and so on collaborate a lot on these issues. He is the econometrician that does the mathematical economics required to do this stuff. And Sudhir said, you know, Naresh, we just are getting attention with the HDI. Please, let's not make it complicated. So in the policy world, we have this problem. I'm attached to the School of Public Policy, so we need to recognize this. It seems as though policymakers, for some reason, will prefer to deal with something that is basic, simple, like per capita GNP and HDI, very crude measures, because like, they can't deal with complexity. Now we should make things simpler, but like Einstein said, no simpler. Make them as simple as you can, but no simpler. And what he was trying to say was that in our attempts to make things very, very simple, we lose out sometimes necessary complexity. And that's crucial. So that's what we have done with all our lives in this business. Just let me say to you that none of these is finished. All of them are present in today's concept of development. So when you want to explain what development means, that's one way to do it. So after all of that stuff, we had a bunch of conferences in the 1990s from everything, starting from children through women and gender equality and population and food security and social development, And all those conferences then led to the Millennium Development Goals, the Declaration and the Goals, the 8 goals. Just to remind you, they are included the eradication of extreme hunger and poverty, universal primary education, gender equality, child mortality, and so the list goes on, as you can see in the second bullet. And they have goals on all of them, targets rather, and indicators which measure how we are doing on all of those. The good thing is that bringing these goals together has done a great job. And I have to say that even the cynicism that I had at the beginning has to be put aside, because we have done as an international community, as a community of nations and of people, we have done a reasonable job at achieving the MDGs. We have still a far way to go, but we have done good stuff. Well, most UN reports and World Bank reports have a classic formula. All of them conclude the same thing. They say we have achieved a lot so that everybody gets happy and the donors are encouraged, and then they say we have much more to do. So that's the formulation that you will find in most of these reports, and maybe it's true, because in the complex world we have. So I think we have to celebrate the success and recognize that we have learned a lot, and we know, I would argue, how to reduce poverty. And we're going to do it. That's my conviction. But we have some other problems to deal with on our way there. And some of the reasons for optimism, you know the famous basket case? Well, I shouldn't be using that language. I never believed that language. But somebody had described Bangladesh as a basket case in economic terms years ago. I know Sudarshan knows that person well, so I'm not going to call the name. But Bangladesh is now celebrated in the 2013 HDR as a star performer, going ahead of India in its human development measurements. Not in per capita GNP, still way behind on that one, but in a number of other indicators.
What was the difference in gap between India and Bangladesh?
They figure that Bangladesh's HDI performance is about twice as good as India on average. So, and then it's very interesting to look at those countries that we were all going to consider basket cases in a way. They are now all being celebrated and doing great. So there is good reason for optimism that we are getting there. When you look at, I just was in Africa a few weeks ago, optimism is pretty high. Many countries are doing well. Growth has been more than 5% for more than 20 years now. And this is not petroleum-driven growth, not oil-driven growth. So we have good reason to believe that we can get there. I will argue that other things are going to be more challenging. So the post-2015 agenda, the first thing is we have not achieved all the MDGs, and that will continue to be important. That's point number one. Point number two, we have articulated, and for those of you who want to read further after this, in Rio Plus 20, I just mentioned to you that Rio was 1992, right? So 20 years after Rio, 2012, the world met again. They call it Plus 20. And they talked about a nice phrase called the future we want. And that's on the web. And when I read it through again to refresh my mind to see what is it we had really agreed on, I can't find anything new that Rio Plus 20 had agreed on that was not already debated in the field of sustainable development, except one institutional change, which I considered important. And that change was to replace the Commission on Sustainable Development, which was largely attended by ambassadors and technical people, by a higher level political platform. I think that that's the most important shift that Rio Plus 20 has done, because we always cry out, yes, we can do it, but we lack political will. That's a standard explanation of why we fail in so many things. Well, like I say here, so let political will work. Let's see if it will deliver the goods now that the CSD has done good stuff, but not everything. The other important thing going forward in the post-2015 world is this process that we've been holding now called the world we want. So one was the future we want, but now we have had a very interesting global process in which we have this million voices. This is the people now saying what is the kind of world we want. I don't think we have ever done that before. This is really a fascinating process in which the people of the world are calling, and not a bunch of academics and UN bureaucrats coming together and fashioning a world, the world they think that the world wants, right? And what are these voices calling for? That's the fascinating thing. The agenda they are calling for is around injustice people feel because of growing inequalities and insecurities that exist, especially for the poorer and marginalized people. So it's around injustice, which is interesting. Notice how it's not about the 8 MDGs, a little different. It talks about, and those are the people now saying this, which is again fascinating. They say the challenges are complex and interlinked, requiring a sustainable development agenda that is integrated, holistic, and universal. Now that's not new. We always said that that was what sustainable development was all about. The problem is that we don't know how to do it. Most people will tell you that what you need is greater coordination. Well, they've been saying that for 300 years from the time of Newton, Descartes, and Bacon. But we haven't figured out, because everybody likes to coordinate, right? But nobody wants to be coordinated. So then it doesn't work. Similarly with integration, same thing happens. And holistic is something we all know it's important, but we live in a reductionist world, a world fashioned by the brilliance of Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon and René Descartes. It's all about analytical work. It's all about critical training. So at universities, we train our students to do critical thinking. We don't do constructive thinking, where we rebuild the wholes. We analyze everything to death, and we don't rebuild them. And that whole way of thinking and teaching in the university, in the academe, will have to shift. Yes, critical thinking must continue, but then we need to bring in a complement of, if you like, constructive thinking in the sense of creating wholes, holistic creative thinking. So what is the agenda? It's around equality, justice, and security. That's the new agenda. First point is that some of the MDGs need to continue. We have not achieved them. But this agenda on equality, justice, and security, many of us would have argued 30 years ago, was always the real agenda. But we have picked the low-hanging fruit, which I would call the MDGs. The real challenges are now to be done, and governance is at the heart of this. So what will be required? That's the agenda. So what will be required to make it happen? Like I mentioned, this stuff has been around forever. We always have been crying for a better world, the world we want, nothing new. Was it 1948 or thereabouts, when we did the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was essentially saying, talking about the kind of world we want. So why has progress been so slow? Here are some of my own views on this matter, and they are not limited to me, others share it as well. I will argue that the real challenge of sustainable development remains the same. It's always, to put it simply, it's two points that you need to know. One is that the world has too many people who are over-consuming, and similarly it has too many people who are under-consuming. That's the big issue. And the reason that we are over-consuming, it's not like we are all eating to get obese. It's driven by some other important factors. We somehow feel in the world that the quality of life is linked to consumption, and that the only way we improve the quality of life is when we consume more. So you have a better quality of life if you have 2 cars rather than 1. And we celebrate that. So that's the first thing. But the bigger problem is that the only way we know to create economic growth is through consumption. Well, maybe there are 1 or 2 other ways, some infrastructure investment or 1 or 2 things like that, but that's not the big issue. You look at the economic growth, that's real economic growth happening wherever it's happening, even in India, and it's driven by consumption, by and large. Every time you have a large splurge in economic growth, is driven by consumption. When we have a stagnation and we don't have growth, what do? Governments put stimulus packages in, largely to stimulate consumption. That's what I would argue. Now, as long as the world cannot figure out another way to have growth, and there must be other ways, there are, right? Love economy, services economy, a whole bunch of other things one might talk about. If we are going to continue to count economic growth as the most important factor in reducing poverty, and we think it's important for quality of life, but we link it to increased consumption, then we really have a problem. We won't get it right. And then the other large part of the world that's under-consuming. And now the over-consuming, I would argue, are over-consuming by choice, but the under-consuming are consuming by lack of choice. In fact, the definition of poverty is really a lack of choice. So that's our issue. It has been the same. Now, that's the sustainable development issue. Now, quickly, the issue that the post-2015 issue, like I showed you, the million voices are calling for inclusion and equality. That's their big agenda. What are we going to have to do to get that right? What's the analysis? What's driving inequality and exclusion? Well, I would argue, first of all, that capitalism is doing a great job at creating more wealth, but it does not do a great job at distributing wealth. That's not its job anyway. Its job is to create wealth. Democracy's job is to create equality and inclusion. And we are not doing so well in democracy. So that's our first issue, and that's where I believe a lot of this inequality and exclusion, the social contract is either tired or torn and needs to be renewed. The social contract between state and citizen. The next point I will argue is that the world is divided and exclusion is driven by a whole range of social challenges such as caste, ethnicity, tribe, politics, religion, a skewed ownership of assets, and so on. These drive inequality and exclusion as well. Then unequal access to public services, education, health, public services, infrastructure. Rapid growth, many of us felt at one point that when you had rapid growth, you had to live with inequality, that inequality was a necessary corollary of rapid growth. The current data shows that is not so. That it does happen, but it's not necessarily so. In fact, many economists believe 33, 4 decades ago that inequality was necessary for growth. I think most of them have become reformed now and don't believe that anymore. But we also have what Douglas North will call closed access societies. Closed access societies is about those people, the elite in economics, who seek favors and loyalties from politicians, and politicians who seek rent from the economic elite. Unfortunately, while we introduce market economics to many developing countries, they don't work well because we have what is called a closed access society. You don't have complete and open competition either in politics or in economics. North, Doug North is quite an interesting character. I don't know if any of you have met him, but I've had the great pleasure of having met him on more than one occasion. And he's a very jolly and merry old fella. I said to him, for example, you know, Professor North, he said, no, Doug. So I said, well, Doug, you know, you've created a big problem in the world with your work in institutions. The world was very kind to you to give you the Nobel Prize. But the problem is that nobody ever uses these words, institution and organization, differently. They always confuse the two. So every time they use the word institution, they tend to mean organization. And we all know that that's not what you meant, and so we have total confusion. So he smiled and he said, well, that's fun, isn't it? But then he decided to write something he calls Towards an Explanation of All of Recorded Human History. He's not a small guy. He's a small guy in stature, but not in thinking. Quite arrogant, isn't it? To explain all of recorded human history. And in that work, he talks a lot about closed access societies. Let us examine our own societies to see how closed we are, and then think about whether market economics is going to lead to inclusion or exclusion. And the final point on this story is, before I go to solutions, is informality. We are looking at 4 billion people on the planet. That's the work of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, of which I had the privilege of having been the director. That commission that was chaired by Madeleine Albright and Hernando de Soto. And our big finding was that these 4 billion people who live in the informal sector are not able to use the law to improve their lives. They see the law as punitive. So, solutions to inequality, look, we know how to solve it. We, humanity. And I've given you one example of a country that is beginning to solve the problem of inequality and exclusion, and that's Brazil. And I Association of Small and Medium Enterprises, WASME, which at that time was headquartered in Delhi, in India. And I came here to present that paper. But I did some research before I prepared the paper of small and micro businesses in South Africa, India, Brazil, and all I found was occupational hazards, environmental pollution. You look at Chandni Chowk, or I don't know if I got it right, but Old Delhi, and you see a guy who is filling a disposable lighter. He's making it non-disposable now, which is a great innovation, but he's filling it with inflammable gas with an open flame next to him. And the place, it has one bulb in a corner. Most micro businesses are run like this. They have no standards, no environmental standards. They sort of somehow can't afford it because they probably go take microcredit. And then the microcredit is 100% interest, but for various other reasons. And that is why I think that while we tend to celebrate micro, small, and medium enterprises, we got some work to do at the policy level, at the empowerment level, at the capacity building level, and it will not be teaching business like you teach the typical MBA drawn or borrowed from the West. We will have to reinvent the MBA in our business schools. Not here. No, here gets it right. I'm sure. I don't think Dean Gopinath is here, but and we, I believe, will have to, we have argued, and you have a bunch of stuff to do, like taxes and registration and providing services, and how do you, progressive environmental protection laws and so on. They can't meet these standards overnight, and therefore we have to have progressive regimes in getting there. But local government, I would argue, has a very important role. These micro, small, and medium enterprises need to go to a local, a one-stop shop where they can get all that they need. And I would argue that that should come from local government. Now, that might be a dream. I'm trying to do that. I have been trying to do that in some other countries. I don't know whether it's doable in India, but I will argue that that should be a vision. And then we can figure out how to do it. The last thing that I'll mention, the fourth piece of the agenda, or penultimate, is the agenda. I couldn't finish this talk, of course, without mentioning the work of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, in which Dean Sudarshan played an important role when he helped me to get a few things done. And he has all of this experience and wisdom. You have to draw from this stuff. But I told you what we found, and our recommendations here have to do with legal identity. Half of the people of sub-Saharan Africa, babies that are born, 15 million babies that are born every year in sub-Saharan Africa are not registered at birth. Many of them grow up without legal identity, and therefore, what kind of a citizen you have? You don't have legal identity. How do you get access to social programs? How do you get a passport, or da-da-da-da-da, things we take for granted. But then the other aspects of this agenda have to do with access to justice and rule of law, property rights, security of tenure, labor and business rights, and overall making the law work for everyone. Now in India we have great examples. I would argue some of the students that I discussed this bill with feel otherwise, but I would argue that, for example, the 2012 Street Vendors Bill is a really progressive bill. And it is showing a bill that is dealing with the informal sector, with people who are excluded. And the reason you are getting that kind of legislation, I believe, is because you have NASV, the National Association of Street Vendors of India, which is more than 1 million strong. So people have to form groups and demand change. And that's what legal empowerment is. So what's the difference then between legal empowerment and legal reform? In legal reform, the end product is a change in the law. In legal empowerment, the end product is a change in who has control over their lives. It's a change in power relations. It's using law to help people improve their lives. And it's about people demanding those changes in the law. And it's not only about enforcement of law, like a few advocates of the Supreme Court of India have argued with me. They have said to me that the Indian Constitution is the best in the world. It treats all Indian citizens equally. I said, oh. So I pulled out a little book that had been given to me as a gift by Naresh Saxena. N.C. Saxena. The title of the book was The Anti-Poor Laws of the Poor in the Food Sector of India. Not anti-poverty, anti-poor. So some laws have to be changed. All of what I've been telling you so far might look like an old agenda. The what might look old to you. The how, I would argue, is fundamentally different. Otherwise, it will not work. And this is what I call the fundamental shifts. The first one is most of our work in designing projects and programs is based on logical frameworks. The famous log frame, for those of you who have designed projects for either the UN or bilateral agencies. It's based on reductionism. We have to move to using complex adaptive systems for both monitoring and evaluation, as well as the design of projects and programs. It is known how to do that. Not enough people are using it. It's a move from or to and. So every time you see the word or, replace it by and you're getting closer to reality. We have to move from a world in which we fit realities into our theories to a world in which we get theories that explain reality as it is. A world in which power is essentially a zero-sum game. If you haven't thought about it, think about it. You inherently believe, all of you here, no, not all of you, that power is a zero-sum game. That for you to be right, I have to be wrong. Well, that might be true, but we have to have a vision in which that will change. So one of the chapters of this book I'm writing is strategies and case studies of how power becomes a positive-sum game. Now, we have two ways of thinking about planning the future. One is, and people will say, I am pragmatic, so I work with the world as it is, and I will try to make it better. And then the other group says, what is the world we want? What is the world we wish for? And then work towards that dream. I will argue that neither of those are going to produce the results we desire. Within the world as it is today is an emergent world that's not yet the future world we wish, and we have to identify where that new world is emerging and begin to learn those lessons and work with that world. I call that the emergent world. Somebody just wrote a book, and I'm just stealing the title, From Ecosystem to Ecosystem. I just like the words, but you know what I mean. From the ecosystem economy in which you maximize self-interest to an ecosystem economy in which you work with a collective. And therefore a shift from equilibrium economics to evolutionary economics. I've always celebrated and allowed people like Joseph Schumpeter to be my mentors in economics, and I have been, my economic thinking has been fashioned by evolutionary economics rather than general equilibrium theories. I mean, they have their values and their limitations. I'm not knocking one or the other. I'm just sharing with you my personal views of how I think. And finally, I have gotten the courage today, because this is a small room, to say that we have to shift from religion to secular spirituality. That is really going to make a collective humanity go forward. And I'm talking about Reinventing the Sacred, which is another book. That's the title of the book, Reinventing the Sacred. Vice Chancellor, the reason I am hesitant to speak on these things is because people might think I'm getting into New Age, and people might think I'm talking about God. This is not God or no God conversation. I'm not in that business. I am more into the Alexander Pope business, the proper study of mankind, or what he said, propose not God to scan, for the proper study of mankind is man. That's what I'm talking about. But I also had, in order to, the agenda is essentially a human agenda. And therefore I must ask the question, stealing a little bit from Amartya Sen, who had given this famous talk on what it is like to be a human being, and he had stolen from Thomas Nagel. I always thought this Sudarshan to remind me of Thomas Nagel, who had written a book, a paper called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. And you know the kinds of identities we assume, and how do we peel them off so that our essential humanity comes out? I am tired of us celebrating diversity. I know how important it is. But why don't we also celebrate our oneness? We are 99% the same and only 1% different. And all we talk about is diversity and not unity and oneness. So we have some shifts to make. And you know, this residual cosmic consciousness, which I truly believe in, all of this needs to be given academic respectability. All you get when you talk in an academic atmosphere is cynicism about these things. And so my last bullet is about how academia will begin to give respectability. And you know it can, because there was a time when you get the same sniggles and the same sneering when you talk about behavioral economics. The same reaction. And now it's highly respected. Now the future Nobel Prize winners in economics, I will predict, are going to come from behavioral economics rather than from mathematical economics. And I think Professor Parkash has seen that, and he's shifting his work himself. So. It's going to come, you know, from happiness studies and all of that good stuff that's beginning to become objective. And therefore, the time has come where any respectable university must have a school of humanities and liberal arts that will forge this transition and begin to narrate what I will call a new civilization narrative. So that leads me to the final thing. You know, I outlined 4 bits of an agenda, or 5, Mr. Chairman. Let me conclude by just reminding my audience what they were. In case you probably didn't recognize, when I talk about inclusive prosperity, there's a school here that I think fits well this agenda. That school, I will think, is the School of Government and Public Policy. This one is your School of International Affairs. This one is your School of Business. And this one is your School of Law. And this one is your emerging School of the Humanities and Liberal Arts. So, Mr. Chairman and my dear audience, the agenda I've outlined to you was global, but since you are local, I had to show you what the school, what role I might play, what role you might play in helping the post-2015 agenda. And I hope that Vice-Chancellor and deans and faculty and students, that you will take this agenda on. And Vice-Chancellor, given a chance, I'll be happy to help you make it happen. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was truly inspiring, and rarely in recent times I stayed through an entire lecture. So obviously it was so, invigorating in terms of its content and the way you presented it. Thank you so much for that, and I'm sure we will have enough opportunities to talk about the substantive content of it. In fact, I want to take this opportunity to tell you that this entire issue relating to human rights and development, which you covered in good part of your presentation, as somebody who's trained in law and worked in the field of human rights, I've always been fascinated by the relative reluctance on the part of lawyers to look at development issues more seriously, and obviously equally frustrated by the skepticism and hesitation on the part of economists to look at human rights and legal issues. In fact, as you remember, Amartya Sen in his the UNDP's Human Development Report 2000, in which he beautifully argued about the relationship of human rights and development. And then, of course, after nearly 6 or 7 years after that, Philip Alston, who was my teacher at NYU, he wrote a very powerful article entitled, essentially, Human Rights and Development, Ships Passing in the Night. That was published in the Human Rights Quarterly. And what he argued in that is that these two discourses have been pretty much happening independent of each other, and the convergence that ought to happen has been one of the biggest challenges of contemporary growth and development. I would like to believe that many things that you said today is also being reflected in the current and emerging thinking, at least in this country, where nearly 30 years back, when the Constitution of India was used to expand the rights jurisdiction to pretty much protect and evolve and develop what we would call in the human rights language civil and political rights, is today and in the last decade significantly expanded. And I will say that and stop there, which is 5 major developments, from right to information, to right to education, to right to employment guarantee, to right to food, and then of course the land acquisition in the form of right to compensation. I think this convergence, that is where the economists and lawyers, development practitioners and human rights activists coming together, is probably one of the salient developments which I think is going to shape the future of some of the issues that you raised. So I would like to thank you and indeed congratulate you for this lecture. I sincerely hope that we will have an opportunity to publish your distinguished lecture in the Jindal Journal of Government and Public Policy. I would like to present a token of appreciation for your lecture and visit. Unfortunately, I have to rush and will not be participating in this ensuing discussion, as I have 5 more meetings till midnight and I have a 6 a.m. flight to take. So we will excuse me for that. Dean, I would like to now you to continue chairing the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Raj.
I'll see you.
The floor is open. Yes, Liz.
Thank you so much. I really didn't expect what I heard. I thought, given the title, I would come here and hear some very depressing news about the impossibility of preventing poverty and working with the ODGs post-2015. I have a question, which is that you started off by talking about the problem of poverty and the environment not being linked together. My question is, and I'm in the human rights and the legal business, to what extent does the legal empowerment and the human rights-based approach to development actually bring in the environment? I mean, is this just another mantra? Is it just the new flavour of the month?
I think by and large, the traditional approach to human rights does not. More and more, it is getting there. And the way it gets there, I think, is by using a framework such as the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, in which you start with assets. You see, when you see environment as an important asset of the poor, and you then start to talk about property rights linked to the protection of that key asset, the natural assets. In fact, there was a well-known colleague here in India who has since passed, Anil Agarwal, who used to use GNP per capita as gross nature's product rather than gross national product. And it's bringing in the property rights link, Article 17 of the International Human Rights Declaration, to link to the natural resources as a link that will do this. And so in our agenda, and when we talk about legal empowerment of the poor, we bring it in. And we link human rights to poverty reduction. In fact, we argue very strongly in that, and Arjun Singh Gupta was very important in making the argument that these 2 ships, markets and human rights, passing each other in the night, can be bridged. He felt that India was bridging this. A number of commissioners did not agree with him. But I also believe that human rights and markets can work together, and human rights, markets, poverty, and the environment can work together.
Thank you, Naresh, for this insightful lecture. I have 2 points, basically a clarification of a question. The first is the donor bashing. See, in India we have a tradition. The IAS officers, when they resign from IAS or they come out from the IAS, they bash the government. So the judges, when they retire, they bash the judiciary. So, but this donor bashing was something very new for me, because most of the donors after getting out are still in the consultancy business. So they don't bash their aspiring employees. So thank you very much for that. But But the related point that I'm saying is coming to is that, see, when you listed the first slide, where you're trying to show the changes which have come up, that does not go with the donor bashing. And, why does it go to donor bashing? Because those were all instruments. The theoretical underpinnings of each and everything were the same. And even the solutions which you are suggesting, again they are instruments of a tinkering of the institutions. Okay, you can do this. So the vision which you are promoting is a radical change, where poverty and human rights and things has to be acknowledged, respected and ameliorated. But the instruments again which you are suggesting an instrument which have the same theoretical underpinnings, which is not compromising on the macroeconomic growth model. I'll just take 30 seconds and then see even the Brundtland Commission you're talking about, or even forget Brundtland Commission, if you take systems, capitalism, socialism, the basic idea why systems differs is all are based on economic growth, but how you redistribute the growth that matters. So in the solutions which you are suggesting and even the earlier first slide, there is no radical shift in underpinnings of redistribution. And when you're quoting the Brazil example, which is the cherished case in the present international arena, you are not giving us those underpinnings which has managed the growth with equity concepts. So what is that? And because I'm also looking, I'm trying to understand what are the theoretical underpinnings of this shift.
Okay, I'm looking for my slides, but I don't know where it is. I don't think it's there. So, here it is. So look, that is why what I'm arguing is the following. This is about having one foot in the old world, one foot in the new world, but really working with what I call the emergent world. So that's what's causing the confusion, I think. But the first thing I should say is the issue of donor bashing. Those people who know me, while I was in the UN, I had exactly the same views, and I said them. And while I was at CEDA, even at the very senior level, I had the same views, and I shared them. Because I thought that we had to have a healthy self-criticism and of our own selves in order to go forward. That has not always served me well in terms of my career, but I think it has served, if I have made a small contribution, it has served that contribution better than, so that's on the bashing issue, which is not always bad. But what I'm arguing for is that we are in a world that's stuck with growth, linked to consumption and all of that, so some of that has to continue. But on my slide, on fundamental shifts, this is not the same as the old agenda. This is not the same set of solutions, which I think you will agree. Let's see if I can just quickly, let me just go here. Right. These are fundamental shifts that are not the same instruments as we use today. So yes, the success I'm celebrating like everybody else is Brazil. I don't have any other better success to give you right now. And yes, I still believe that macroeconomic stability will continue to be very important. But a number of issues in case of the distribution, how do you participate? You see, that's why I distinguish between growth with equity, equitable growth, and inclusive growth, and talk more about non-alienation and participation in the growth process. I'm not defining inclusive growth as pro-poor growth or employment-based growth in which we don't know how to do, we only say so, right? Sometimes growth creates jobs and sometimes it doesn't, and we come up with all kinds of plasters in it that don't always deliver. I'm talking about quite a new world, but in order not to be dismissed by the hard-nosed world of academia and practical policymakers, and I will easily be dismissed by them, I have to have a foot in each of these two worlds. That's why I'm creating a bit of confusion and perhaps contradiction.
Okay, I think it's not clear to me what is so special about 2015, because it gives the impression as if there is some word authority which is deciding when the change is to be brought, but it doesn't work like that. Second, you begin with that, developing countries were more interested in getting rid of poverty, reducing poverty. Developed world was more interested in environmental issues. And this led to the sustainable development, the agenda sustainable. But it hasn't played out that way, because sustainable development has become something like that is to be done by the developing countries and not by the Western countries. Okay? And this comes out very clearly if you look at the negotiations of climate change. It comes out very clearly there. Okay? That it is the burden is trying to be pushed onto the Now, third thing, I think somewhere you said that apart from removing inequality or poverty, governance is also very important. Now, that is, I think, very interesting, because currently we have two parties. One is saying good governance, the other is saying remove poverty, but it seems that both are not really alternatives, but really part of the same thing. Fourth, you see, I personally believe for something to work, it should be simple and straightforward. Okay? But you propose sound very complex, and that it will work. It may also not work like the previous, things that have come, because one has to understand that social change, which is essential for this to happen, is a very slow process. Even for little changes in culture and social thinking, it may take several generations. So the people have to be patient to see these things are not going to happen over time. And I think I did see that coming out from you. That, it is a very slow process. Forget about. I think you are saying it's impossible, but I would put it. It's not impossible, but it's a slow process. You should see the results. And lastly, you described me as mathematical economist. I think that word is past, right? And I'm not really a mathematical economist. I do a lot more things.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, and I do a lot more things than just mathematical economics. And also behavioral economics has not yet acquired destructibility that you seem to think it has. Okay? And it's not clear. It actually now started. It had a blip and now it's going down. As is the case with most subjects in economics. They have a life and then there is a life.
I had a very related question, and I thought that maybe I could speak up right now, rather than maybe you could then decide what you want to answer and what you read. So first of all, a very fascinating sweep of issues that the mankind or humankind needs to look at as it gets down together for the 2015 or the post-2015 agenda session. But let me encourage you to put your international diplomat's hat in the hat of a donor, where you spend considerable time, and ask you to pick up one or two or three issues that you could think would add materially to the MDGs to make it into an MDG plus agenda for the 2050. So what would, in your view, would be those one or two or three items that would make a material difference as the world gets together to set the post-2015 development?
One or two simple and straightforward.
Oh, you could make it simple as that.
Let me first react to this issue of simple and straightforward and make it clearer, a lot simpler. See, when we send a rocket to the moon, let me explain to you what I mean by complexity. When we send a rocket to the moon, that's a very complicated venture, but it's not complex. Complexity is better illustrated by bringing up a child. So bringing up a child is a very complex process. Sending a rocket to the moon is quite straightforward. When you get it right one time, you have a high probability of getting it right again. When you bring up a child once, those of us who are bringing up children, you have no way of knowing whether you will get it right the second time. That child has a mind of its own. It's a human being, and when you deal with human agenda, you're dealing with complexity. When you deal with ecosystems, you're dealing with complex systems. Our attempt to make them simple has been to reduce them to linear progression methods. That's what I'm arguing about. That removal of adaptation, that removal of growth, that removal of changing your mind, removing that from the equation and making it simple like that goes wrong. So complexity is not the same as complicated. Completely different. And you have to understand the difference between building a bridge, doing physical systems work, and doing natural systems and human systems. So let's leave it at that for now. Otherwise we'll take too long here and hold this thing up. So that we need to be clear about. No, I only refer to you as a, with due respect, as a mathematical economist because I found that in the bulletin just published.
By
The profile by Tyndall School.
no, I don't.
Yeah, it's in there. I just read that. Check it and see.
I would so.
So that's there. So that's my source. Let me quote the source. But, now, apart from that, I accept most of what you say. The issue of patience and this taking a long time, I fully accept. I didn't say that, but I agree with you fully. That this is a very long-term agenda. You made an interesting point about the 2015 date. What's fascinating about it? And the work.
What is so special?
What is so special about it? The world came together, and what is even good about those targets? You know, all of those are artificial. The United Nations is a forum of nations in which they get together, and they figure out how they think they might best mobilize political will, mobilize resources, account for it, and then they set up there's nothing special apart from nations coming together and setting a new date. They could have chosen 2019 for all I care.
But
So it doesn't matter.
you see, I mean, development is a much more bigger process than
Absolutely.
UN is thinking or
And all I'm referring
go
to,
to a village and they don't even know what UN.
I'm fully agreeing with you on that. So the 2015 thing is what the UN talked about. It's a useful thing to use in a conversation. But let me come to the other issue that you raised, Rajiv. I think the first point, I made the point that the MDGs have not been achieved fully. And there are some clear goals which remain to be addressed. So donors are going to continue, I think, to work on that. I think the big shift, wearing my donors.
That's why I call MDG plus.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to use that phrase. Because I do think that what the million voices are calling for is somewhat different. They are closer to what I think Prakash is calling for, which is not the kind of traditional UN donor kind of thing. It's what is happening fundamentally in the development evolutionary process of the villages and in human beings. And I'm nearer to that. So I believe the real shift is about triangular cooperation. It's about how they work with each other rather than what they address. And so I think the North-South-South cooperation, that mechanism, it's going to be very different. Let me wear the donor hat for a moment and say that I think I can speak quite freely about, now that a year has passed since I left the Canadian International Development Agency. I couldn't speak for 1 year freely, but you know, we are, as civil servants, we have to observe 1 year. But now that year is done. Most northern donors, the agenda is driven largely, and I know you know this, but the audience might not, it's driven very largely by our local politics. And when we make decisions, we always have to bear in mind, every time as a Director General in Strategic Planning, when I make 3 options to my minister, I have constantly to be thinking, what is the impact, or how will she explain that to the Canadian people? That's crucial in our decision making. We also have to look at what other donors are doing, what they're funding. We do look at what the priorities as stated by that country is. Typically, you know, how do you get a priority of India? If SIDA wanted, of course we were kicked out from India a long time ago because we were far too small, Canadian SIDA. How does SIDA determine a priority for funding in a country like India? It's kind of not possible. So what you get is the foreign affairs minister, or or whoever is the liaison, will write a letter to the Minister of Development and Cooperation and say the government of India's priorities are. Now they might be the government of India, but they're not India's priorities. They're the government at that time. So the issue is, how do we get down to real people priorities, and how do we get down to addressing change which North-South could not, and I believe the solution to that will come from South-South-North to a certain extent. So I would not want to put pragmatic targets, and I will not call it MDG plus.
Yes, sir.
I have just a comment and a question. Singh, comment is about what you have raised. What's so sacrosanct about 2015 and 8 MDG goals? I have worked for the United Nations for more than 15 years, and I can tell you that there is nothing sacrosanct about those. I think it's just that the delegations who come to represent the country with the United Nations, they have only 3 days time. They have to go out and do some shopping, sightseeing, and they are asked to set some targets. They are asked to set some dates, so they will just finish it off and say, okay. One says 2015.
That's just looking from a UN.
That's a joke, but
is a much bigger.
yeah, that's a joke, but that's the reality also. Now, on this point of, I want to make a substantive point of consumption. We have talked about consumption pattern, but I didn't see it, maybe it's somewhere here in the fundamental shifts, and you didn't suggest any fundamental shift in consumption pattern, which is, in my view, one of the most important elements in mankind. In this world, we have 1.3 billion people, now it has come down a little bit, who earn less than $1 per day. And you have 1.1 billion people who are obese or overweight. And so that's a total of 2.4 billion people in this world. And by merely reducing the consumption pattern of the rich in developing countries and in the developed countries, because there are some rich people in the developing countries also, there are many of them. Just by reducing the consumption pattern of the rich, you can benefit, I would say, 2.4 billion people in this world. Of course, I'm not assuming that if you don't eat much, that food will be distributed to the poor who is sitting on the street. But by and large, there will be some shift of nutritional value that the poor people get if you reduce your consumption, if I reduce mine. And I'm suggesting that, as you said, we have to be all practical. If we today promise that we will reduce our consumption pattern a little bit, I think there is a chance, if not 2.4 billion, 2 billion people will be benefited. So what is that fundamental shift in your agenda? That's my question.
The reason that I left it where I did was that most of the policy instruments that are there, that the rich world are using to address this issue are context specific rather than global policy prescriptions. And that is why I thought I would speak generally about a value shift. I think the issue is values. And to talk about values has to do with a whole range of instruments, some economic, some awareness, some recognition of your own humanity, some has to do with leadership, and so on. In Canada, if we talk about consumption, for example, we have about the highest per capita emission of greenhouse gases. Now, we want to, at one point we used to take a leadership as Canadians and figure that we were taking a leadership role in international affairs. I don't think we can claim that anymore. We have lost that moral ground. But Canada is an extremely cold country. And it will be a little bit different from India. Here, I have a very interesting experience. My room is cold, so outside is warm. See, in Canada, our homes are warm and outside is cold. We have a kind of a reverse issue because we heat the place. And to heat your homes in a very cold country consumes a lot of fuel. So one of the shifts has to be clean fuel and so on. So the policy instruments that you use is really context specific.
Because it is cold and warm. Somebody described it in Singapore while introducing at a conference. We have winter inside, summer outside. Go ahead.
Thanks for your talk, Professor. It was really inspiring. I have two questions. First of all, you say that capitalism is doing well because it is creating wealth, but it is failing in distribution. But others suggest that others argue that capitalism is creating wealth by disposition. So I will try to disagree with this point of view. And the second question is when will growth shift from numbers to real benefits for people? When you can ask people, is your country growing? And the person will say, yes, my country is growing, rather than seeing on the numbers. Because I'm saying this because you brought the example of Brazil. You said that it is doing well and the Gini coefficient dropped by 9% from 2001. But it has been more than 3 months now that Brazilians go to the streets and they demand for better redistribution of wealth, better social security schemes, because there are reports that politicians are getting benefit from Bolsa Familia, which is the biggest social security scheme in Brazil, and more other things. They are demanding for everything. So, and you again you said that in sub-Saharan Africa, the GDP is growing by more than 5% per annum.
In some countries.
Yeah, yes, including mine. Yeah, it is growing by more than 7%.
There you go.
But the data is saying that you won't ask, people won't tell you that, yes, I agree with that. People don't, native people don't agree with that data. So my question is, when will growth shift from numbers to real benefits for people? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should ask the economists in the room to answer that one. But I wouldn't cop out. I've shared my thoughts. Other people might have other views. Mr. Chairman, I'm quite happy for people more knowledgeable than me in some of these questions to answer them. But anyway, let me answer from my perspective. I think more and more we are measuring progress in terms of indicators which are closer to the material condition of human beings. From the days when we measured it in terms of per capita GNP, or we measured poverty, for example, only as income poverty, we have moved a lot from that time to the time when we start measuring what we call human poverty. In addition to income, we brought in literacy rates, we brought in life expectancy, and we call it human rather than income. And now we have moved further on to beginning to measure what we call the multidimensional poverty index, which was developed at Oxford, multidimensional poverty index, and has been used in the 2013 HDR, in which we have 10 indicators. So they are looking now at whether they have a better floor, whether they have electricity, whether they have a bicycle. All these are now being used to measure whether people are doing better, rather than just the per capita GNP. So hopefully, the relationship of growth to the general welfare or the quality of life will be improving more and more. I don't have a date by which it will happen, how long it will take. It's going to take a long time, but it's getting there. I think we're doing better and better. On the other issue, it takes a while for us to see those changes. And when we see per capita GNP, I consider it to be necessary, but it's far from sufficient. So you're not going to be seeing right away changes in people's quality of life. Finally, on Brazil, I quoted Brazil, not because it's perfect, because it's one of the better examples of a bad lot. Things are bad, but Brazil is doing a little bit better than those, and we need to see it in that light. Also, Brazil happened to have been one of the most unequal economies in the world, so that the progress it's making will still take a while for a large number of people to be happy. It's going to take quite a while. So I'm not surprised at large numbers. I think it's a good thing that those numbers that are excluded are doing what they're doing, because that's how change takes place, but through the legal empowerment process. See, I sat down, for example, with the president of Brazil, Cardoso, Enrique Cardoso, and I asked him, he was the first two-term president of Brazil. I asked him, Mr. President, what was your most difficult political challenge while you were president? And his answer was land redistribution. See, while the income is changing and so on because of cash transfers, fundamental asset ownership is skewed. And a lot of people are going to be excluded until that reform also takes place. In South Africa, the ANC campaign on land redistribution, that's the first thing they're going to do. Since the ANC has been in power in 1994, land reform in South Africa is not happening in a big way. That is required for a fundamental rebalancing of the wealth of the society, but it is the most difficult political problem to address. So we have a far way to go.
If I may just, Brazil is one good reason to mention Brazil, apart from, the solutions that are tried out from an economics perspective are pretty much standard, as I seem to say. But what really happened was the creation of the Workers' Party. And that organization will say, no, remember, it was in Porto Alegre that in Brazil that this whole idea of, participative budgeting evolved. And the party was formed in the 70s, 77, 78, and much later, Lula became the most prominent leader of the party. So today, if you see the resistance to or the reactions to the Olympics, the FIFA money that's being spent on that, what are called the slums or the favelas, celebrating the visit of Michael Jackson. I mean, there is a ferment. You see, those are important things that are not captured in some of these numbers. A sense of, possible confidence on the part of the working class in Brazil. And that has to do with the organization and the party as well. And we need to factor that in, because it's not simply, conditional cash transfer and Bolsa Familia and so on, but it's much more than that. So we need to look at the political ferment. You see, if you look at this country, I mean, yes, we're doing badly in many respects, but the one gift of democracy has been really a big churning of the caste system. I mean, it's very important that Mayawati, a scheduled caste woman, becomes the chief minister of the state. It's okay that you may be dismissive of her elephants and her parks or whatever it is, but it does make a big difference to people's sense of self-worth and their self-respect, which is the gift of democracy. It's not yet in the economic front. So I think we need to, as you say, this is part of the sort of the holistic understanding of change. So Brazil is a good example for this reason.
Please. So you spoke about narrative policy analysis. So I assume narrative policy analysis would have a lesser component of numbers and more stories. Otherwise, yes. So we are familiar with cost-benefit analysis. That has more element of numbers, and so one would actually be the realm of possibility, while other is more in probability. In the sense of the difference, where probability would still more towards certainty of results, which may or may not happen. Whereas possibility would you just don't know. So even there is no element of certainty at all. So however the policy needs to be implemented, if there is a policy at all, how would the implementation go?
See, what we do is you bring 2 or 3 what might be called orthogonal policy analytical approaches to the table at the same time. So you do not discard cost-benefit analysis. That's an important piece of it to be included, but it's one. You bring narrative policy analysis in a kind of a qualitative analysis of the policy issues as seen through the eyes of the people. There is also used nowadays to analyze complex systems, not only narrative policy analysis and cost-benefit analysis, but also critical theory, local justice systems, and so on. There is a book, a reference that you might want to look at, called Narrative Policy Analysis, which Emory Rowe did in 1994, but he did another one called, I think the same title I used, Making Policy in the Face of Complexity, where he talks about Ricardian economics. You know, this is herd behavior. Well, one person goes in a certain way, nobody knows why he's going, but they all follow him. Like the stock market behavior. So he's done an analysis of these alternative approaches and how you combine them. So the trick is in the combination of more than one. Now, for a long time, for example, we did not know how to integrate quantitative and qualitative analyses. But that is now pretty well known. And we're doing that routinely. I myself do that right now for some policy work we're doing in MS. So that's how you bring it in. Some have all have strengths and weaknesses. You bring them together and you get different perspectives.
Yes, go on.
Yes, my question about capitalism.
Yes.
But before that, I would like to say about Brazil again that people started demanding all these services and better redistribution of wealth just because they came to know that the country is spending too much to organize this World Cup football, so they are not so happy as it seems.
Oh yes, I did not, I'm sorry, to respond to your point about capitalism and democracy. The point I am making about capitalism is, I am saying that the job of capitalism is not distribution. The job of capitalism is creation of capital, more and more. Whether it's in the hands of few or the hands of many, they are not bothered with that. That's not the issue, right? So capitalism both creates immense capital and destroys it as well from time to time, like it did recently in the 2008 onwards financial crisis. And I was arguing that the mere creation of wealth in the hands of few people is not necessarily a social good. It's not what society wants. But what society wants is not articulated through capitalism. It's articulated through the best form of government that we have right now, which is called democracy, with all its weaknesses, like Churchill said, right? Remember the Churchillian definition of democracy, that is the worst form of government until you try the others, and or a very challenging form at least. So that's the point I was making. I wasn't at all making the point about how bad capitalism is because it doesn't distribute well. And the challenge, therefore, is how do we get these two? See, there was this publication which I found fascinating called Supercapitalism. And there are different types of capitalism. Good and bad capitalism is another book that I've referred to some of the students. I don't know if you have heard that. But you get a whole range, a whole spectrum of different approaches to wealth creation. And I think a better understanding of that might help. So that's my view on the democracy capitalism. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, not at all.
No, then I didn't hear it. I'm sorry. Please, I don't understand it. I don't know if anybody else did.
Maybe you should help him to understand the question.
Please, do it again.
Yes, you said capitalism is good. It's doing well because it is creating wealth. That's your point.
No, I'm not making a value judgment. It's doing its job.
Of creating
Well,
wealth.
that's its job.
However,
Operating more capital. Yeah.
there is another view that says that capitalism is not creating wealth. It is dispossessing wealth. It is transferring wealth from the poorest to the rich, from the south to the north. So when you say it is creating wealth, but it is failing to redistribute.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh,
trying
no,
to disagree with this point.
Okay. So let me reword it. I don't disagree with that. It does that. It does that phenomenally well. So what it's doing is concentrating wealth in the hands of some people. That's probably better explained. So I don't disagree with the view that you put. I have seen it at work, and it does extract wealth from some places because those who have capital have a competitive advantage and they generate much more capital. Does it make sense?
It does create some.
Well, here you one economist is saying it does create some as well. So alternatively,
Yeah, go on.
there might be other views in the room.
Yeah, Professor, I have a question about human development.
Uh-huh.
The discourse of the human development has started since 1970, and early in the later part of 80, the state started taking it seriously in the policy making. And now we have the target agenda set for the human development. My question is, like after in the future, after 30, 40 years from down the line from now, when the world will think that now we have had enough human development that we have thought early thought in the target. Now, what would be the next development that world would come up with that? Okay, now we would focus on this kind of development, right from economic development to human development. Now, human development to what kind of development?
Spiritual development.
Precisely.
Secular,
Precisely.
secular spiritual development.
That's what I'm arguing. I don't know how long it will take. Maybe 500 years. Maybe 100 years. Maybe 40 years. Nobody can predict these things. No? Because, we are famous as human beings for not being able to predict the future. Most of what people like World Bank and so on, we predict the complete opposite tends to happen. So the next big phase, we might have a few phases that I am arguing is secular spirituality, spiritual development. I think that's where it has to.
Yeah, but that's not quite the linear progression.
No, these might go through some.
Because the Gautama Buddha said quite a bit of what you're saying.
I think one child becomes spiritual only in two ways. One is either to kill your wants, or the other is to have him the other way.
Here you have the economist view of. I have a different view.
All right, so I think we've had a great session. Thank you very much, Ganesh. I also can do some orders. This is a pen drive.
Oh.
Pen and a pen